So right now, the model that we have can predict the outcome of a clinical trial with about 90% accuracy. Everything about how humanity interacts with drugs and devices and alternative therapies is actually known within that data set of 400,000 trials that have existed in the world. And all we're doing is pulling out the relevant variables for every phase, for every condition, and just putting it together, and then using that as a knowledge set to make future predictions.
From what I've seen so far from Trialkey is about 60% of the world's trials are designed poorly. There's major design flaws in them. So I think that there's a lot of drugs or devices that would probably have been successful had the trial have been structured correctly. It's not the underlying molecule or compound that was the problem. It was the actual design of the trial that led it to failure. So I think hidden in the data there would be thousands of these drugs or devices that would have shown efficacy.
Hi, I'm Craig Smith, and this is Ion AI. In this episode, I talk to the people behind Opyl AI, that's OPYL.ai, an AI system that predicts with remarkable accuracy whether or not a clinical trial will be successful. And Damon Rashid, CTO, explain how they use natural language processing to extract key variables from trial data and machine learning to predict outcomes. By analyzing over 400,000 past trials, their model can forecast success rates for new trials, helping pharmaceutical companies optimize trial design and helping investors make informed decisions. I hope you find the conversation as amazing as I did. Hi, I wanted to jump in and give a shout out to our sponsor, NetSuite by Oracle. A little quick math. The less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more margin you have and the more money you keep. But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more. So to reduce costs and headaches, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one platform and one source of truth. With NetSuite, you reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessed from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems. You improve efficiency by bringing all of your business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move. So do the math. See how you'll profit with NetSuite. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/IonAI. That's IonAI, EYEONAI, all run together. Again, head to netsuite.com/IonAI. netsuite.com/IonAI for its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program. So, Damon, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself, and then Saurabh, you can go next.
Hi, yes, I'm Damon Rashid. My background is I'm actually an economist, so I spent the first few years of my life working for the equivalent of the Department of Justice over in the US and Australia. It's called the ACCC, so federal regulator. But in the background, I've always had a fascination with data. So I've been running sports betting models, horse racing models, greyhound models, trying to predict the outcome, in these competitive sectors, trying to get an edge over the bookies. So, my day job was working as an economist at the regulator, and by night I was, trying to run models to beat sports betting and racing markets. And these days I run a data science team, and we specialize in providing machine learning solutions, I guess, in where there's difficult problems to solve. We do a lot of consulting for banks, insurance companies, universities, road authorities. So it's been a fascinating journey.
Yeah. And Saurabh, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, totally. So I'm a software engineer by trade. Back when I did my thesis, 20, 25 years ago, it was actually in machine learning. It was all about how do you predict the outcome of patients getting cancer based on about 50 odd variables. And back on those days, you had to literally hand code everything. So I did my 70,000 lines of code to get that model working. Then after that, I did a tech startup, exited to Telstra, which is like the equivalent of like an AT&T here in Australia. Got into sales for about a decade, got into management, was the CEO of a public listed tech business, grew that from about 20 mil to about 100 mil, exited that about 3 years ago, and then stepped in as the CEO of Trialkey about 6 months ago now.
Trialkey is the new name for Opyl, is that right? Or is Opyl the new name for Trialkey?
Yeah, so Opal's the company name, and that's what we're on the stock exchange at. So ticker code is OPL. The actual product that we take to market is Trialkey.
I see. And Damon, you're the CTO at for Trialkey, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we've been working on Trialkey for about 3 years now, and we've only just got it to market in probably the last 4 weeks. So this is the exciting period where we can start to get some feedback about our product.
Yeah. Do you mind starting, Damon, by talking about the sports betting, which I find fascinating? I told you earlier I had a turn at horse racing prediction using supervised learning classifier. What kind of models were you using? What was the success rate? And then how can you relate that to what you're doing at Trialkey?
Yeah, good question. So this is around 2005 that started building sports models, and mainly for US sports and some international sports like tennis and golf. But we were doing National Hockey League, NBA, NFL. So the prediction models at that stage, there wasn't a lot of competition. There weren't a lot of, I guess, statisticians modeling sports back in 2005. So there was quite an edge over the bookmakers. So you could take publicly available data, you could analyze it using pretty simple models back in the day, like traditional linear prober or logit models. Even some simple logistic regression provided some advantage over the market. But as time went on, more and more statisticians came into the market, data became more readily available, and the market became tighter and tighter, and it became harder and harder to win. So you needed more advanced models. And as at that stage, I had other things on, so sports betting sort of took a back seat, and then we started working on this Trialkey product. The way that I see it is that predicting the outcome of clinical trials, which we'll talk about in a second, is kind of like sports betting 20 years ago. There aren't a lot of people doing it at the moment. It's a very virgin industry, and there are opportunities here. It's brand new, and that surprises me given the amount of money spent on clinical trials.
That's right. I haven't heard anybody doing this. I mean, Saurabh and I had a conversation earlier about In Silico, a company that I've had on the podcast and that I follow somewhat, and they're focused on narrowing, increasing the chances of a successful clinical trial by narrowing the scope of small molecules that they're going to put into trial. But I don't think they're doing any predictions on the clinical trials themselves. Is there anybody doing this that you're aware of?
So there's a couple. I mean, I think Encilio are kind of playing in this area, but you're right. They're a lot more on the molecule side. There's another company that we've seen out of Israel that are talking about doing something, but they haven't launched something to market yet. So I think right now we have first mover advantage, but it'll be like the sports betting in a couple of years. Everybody will be doing this.
Yeah. And what happens, Damon, with the sports betting? The odds, the more people that do it, it narrows the odds. So the payoff of a good prediction is fewer and farther between, or is there something else that flattens the curve and makes the opportunity less attractive?
No, I think you nailed it there. So it's more and more people, having predictions and then moving the market, but also the bookmakers themselves have invested significantly in data science capabilities. I know one bookmaker, one of the biggest, that has 50 data scientists working for them, making predictions, and also a lot of professional outfits have what I call private data, where you have this publicly available data, but for some sports like tennis and soccer, those publicly available data sets aren't that detailed. So they have people watching these events and coding their own variables and at scale. And I know, particularly in the UK, some very successful outfits that have won literally billions of dollars by creating their own data set, ignoring what's publicly available and actually hiring resources to create their own data set.
Yeah. And Saurabh, you were talking when we spoke earlier about investing in clinical trials as an investor. I mean, investing in these small pharma companies that are at very low, I don't know what the term is, but their cost of capital is pretty high, and and so you can get in fairly inexpensively, and if you predict a successful clinical trial and they are successful, then the value of the company surges. And I can see maybe that opportunity would narrow as it did in sports betting as this kind of thing becomes more prevalent. But the value of predicting a successful clinical trial to the companies remains the same, right? I mean, if it saves them time and money if they know which drug and which protocol is likely to be successful. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, just even a bit more context. So right now, the model that we have can predict the outcome of a clinical trial with about 90% accuracy. So we get it right most of the time. So if we think about the use cases, I think totally one is on the investment side, because often the probability of success is actually not baked into the share price for a lot of these public companies. Damon and I were one for one. We invested in a company called Demerix. We got in at 10 or 12 cents about 2 months ago. They announced their successful trial mid-March. Now it's about 30 cents. So we've done quite well out of that. We probably need to do this 10 more times just to make sure we didn't get lucky once. But I think the fundamental theory is for one or two drug company, either a success or a failure will have a dramatic impact on their share price. So that's one use case. And the other use case is for the drug company themselves. So if they're running a trial, they might have 2 or 3 different options that they're doing. So we can help them figure out what's most likely going to succeed. And because it's explainable AI, we'll tell them what variables to tweak. So for example, they might have 700 patients, but they actually need 900 for this phase, for this condition. Or they might be using dosage of 25 milligrams, but the data shows for this condition, 50 milligrams is better. Or they might be doing a cream, but the data says, look, a nasal spray is better. So all these kind of nuancy things that we try to do, we did this similarly for another company recently, and we kind of increased their chance of success by about 30%. And this is all stuff that's hidden in the data, but just people don't know because the data set has just gotten so big over time.
Yeah. And let's back up a little bit. I'm sorry I jumped right in on sports betting. But so drug companies, they spend a lot of money in hunting for a pharmacologically active molecule or compound, and then they go through various animal trials, and then they're, at least in the United States, I think it's 3 phases of clinical trials, and all, that whole pipeline is very slow and very expensive. So you don't want to spend money on a clinical trial and have it fail. So you want to pick your bets very carefully, and that's what Trialkey does, right? I mean, that's the value proposition. And can you tell us what kind of data are you using? What kind of data do you need from companies to reach that 90% accuracy that you're talking about?
Totally. So a bit of context about how we got the data source. So what Damon and the guys did, they've sucked down about 400,000 clinical trials from clinicaltrials.gov. So all this data is publicly available. But what took the 3 years of effort was to be able to scrape 700 variables off each of those trials. And 3 months ago it was about 500. A year ago it was probably about two or 300. And we're adding more and more data sets from those variables. And I'm sure Damon can talk about some of the LLMs that he's kind of worked on to help do that. But then the fundamental thesis we have is everything about how humanity interacts with drugs and devices and alternative therapies is actually known within that data set of 400,000 trials that have existed in the world. And all we're doing is pulling out the relevant variables for every phase, for every condition, and just putting it together, and then using that as a knowledge set to make future predictions.
No, that's a good summary. So the challenge that we found was that the actual publicly available data set, clinicaltrials.gov, where most significant trials are registered, is a really badly curated data set. I was going to say more nasty things about it, but that's probably and the problem is that there's no real onus for pharmaceutical companies, drug development companies, etc., to report into that database. So it turns out that only about 17% of all trials ever done, we actually know what the outcome is, that they've been officially reported. Which is, when you think about it, that's a failure. It's a data collection failure, because, as Saurabh said, if we know those, the results of those trials, it could help in the development of new drugs, new medicines, new life-saving interventions. But because the data is so badly curated, we've spent 3 years trying to fix that problem and actually generate our own data set based off that initial publicly available data. So that's what's taken the time. And part of it is around identifying which trials actually passed and which ones failed, but also in the free text that's written, generating a whole stack of variables using advancements in natural language processing. As Saurabh mentioned, that technology just wasn't available 2 or 3 years ago with ChatGPT, etc. We can extract a huge amount of data from those clinical trials, the free text within those clinical trials, using language models. And I don't think anyone in the world has ever done this before. So we're pioneering it, and the results and the insights have been fascinating. So when we go out and talk to people in the industry, they're totally engaged with the results that we're providing, because they've never seen this sort of information. They've speculated on it, but that they've never seen it.
When you say that part of the problem is identifying which trials are successful, aren't trials publicly announced? I mean, at least in the United States, by the FDA.
So once you've done your 3 phases, then you can apply for FDA approval. If you never get to that stage, let's say you have a phase 2 trial and it doesn't succeed, there's an obligation to report, but it's not really policed. So you don't know the status of that phase 2 trial. And the trials aren't linked either. A phase 3 trial, you don't know what the corresponding phase 2 trial was. There's no, in the data set, that just doesn't exist. And initially we thought if a trial wasn't reported on, we just assumed that it must have failed. But that's not actually the case at all. There's many trials, thousands of trials that actually succeeded, but the data was just never updated in the public source. So that made our job difficult, but it was rewarding to sort of solve that problem as well.
Yeah, and a certain amount of this data that you can get publicly, I would guess, is in tabular form already. Is that right? What percentage of the data comes to you structured? And then I want to ask about how you extract data from unstructured text.
Yeah, so out of the 700 variables we've got, probably about 300 are structured. And that's things like, how many patients they're looking to recruit, or what countries are they in, and, who's involved in the trial. That sort of information comes structured. There's a lot of structured data. But then the unstructured data is the fascinating data. And we're talking about things like extracting, the mechanism of action for a drug, or the actual molecules and compounds themselves, or it might be, dosage levels or information about the inclusion-exclusion criteria on a clinical trial, which is, who could get selected or who misses out on the trial. Even but the endpoints that they're trying to reach, their primary and secondary goals of the trial, all of this information is free text. And the only way that you can gain insights from that data is to create that take that free text, apply a natural language processing model, and turn it into more structured data that then you can run through a model. So what we've been doing is creating, the extra 400 or so variables, which will increase significantly in the next 6 months. We've been using language models to create those variables from the free text, and that's the insights from that. It's been, fascinating. So we can, something as simple as, once a patient's enrolled in a trial, how many touch points they have with a particular site or hospital. That's critical information as to whether a trial will succeed or fail. And those insights were unknown before, products like Trialkey came onto the market.
And that's very nuancy. Like a variable like that, if you're doing like life-saving cancer treatment, you tend to not need to touch the patients a lot. But if you're doing like alternative therapies, a vitamin-based observational study, you tend to need to engage with the patients like every couple of weeks. Um, and that's the real kind of nuancy stuff that the models kind of picked up on.
Yeah, and to extract the data, I mean, I imagine a lot of this is at this point prompt engineering. Is that right? Where you're working with a large language model on a block of text, and you're asking it to first of all surface all the variables that it can find in the text. Is that right? And then you decide which of those are likely to be important.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly right. So the prompt engineering is a massive part of what we do. So we're speaking with subject matter experts, and they tell us what they think is important around a trial. That enabled us to create some prompting to try to get that information from the unstructured data, and then to do that en masse, like to do it for 400,000 trials, and lots of prompting as well to extract as much information as we can. It's a big exercise. It takes about a month for our servers to run through and collect that data on 400,000 trials. And then rather than us assign weights to each of those variables that are created, we create a model, and then the machine learning model determines whether that variable has any impact on the probability of success or not. So the machine learning model applies the weights. So for a lot of the data we collected, it had a very minimal impact. But some of the data, those variables are incredibly predictive.
Wow. And it's not to the point yet where you can simply ask a large language model to look at a drug and a protocol and predict based on the weights in its memory whether or not that's likely to be successful. I mean, you're using the large language model to extract parameters, and then you're putting those parameters into a structured format and using a classifier essentially to decide the probability of success. Is that right?
That's exactly right. We actually did try what you just suggested as well, and just to see if the natural language models could predict if you just if that was the prompt. But the predictions that they came out with, very well correlated to our model. So I don't think they're at that stage yet where they can actually add value to the predictions over and above what our model what our model does. I just don't think it's in its realm of capabilities just yet. Maybe one day.
Yeah. And then do you also in the training phase, do you feed post uh, launch data? I mean, into the models because even if a clinical trial is successful, the drug may not be successful. in the marketplace. Do you use any of that data?
Not yet. That's something that's on our development horizon, and also working up the probability of FDA approval as well. Those two things are in our development horizon. We've spent most of our time so far, predicting phases 1 through 3 of clinical trials and haven't looked at a lot of aftermarket data. But yeah, that's definitely a use case for the future.
For now, we're predicting something very narrow. We're predicting whether a trial meets its primary endpoint, which is really, does it answer the question that it's set out to solve? So we're not really predicting whether it's going to make money or whether it's going to be successful. The other thing that we do use the predictions for is a competitor analysis. So remember that Dimerix trade that we told you about? That was a rare kidney disease. So their probability of success was about 55%, but they had about a dozen competitors trying to solve the same problem. But most of those guys had their probabilities in like the teens, 10, 15, 20% success. So that's why we invested in them. We saw them as like a real outlier. Then the other part the model predicts is when they will succeed. So you get a nice kind of almost like a Gantt chart that says, here are you, here are all your competitors, and these ones we think will succeed, and these ones we think will fail. So it gives you a bit of a market analysis, but it is still very, very narrow around the primary endpoint.
Yeah, and the primary input, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so for every trial, there's a goal that they're trying to reach, and they're called, either primary or secondary endpoints or hypotheses. And sometimes, or often, there's more than one primary endpoint, and it might be, is this drug that we're testing, in layman's terms, does it outperform what's currently the benchmark? For this particular condition, or it might be an equivalence test. It might be, does it perform at least as well? There's all sorts of different primary endpoints, and there might be secondary endpoints as well. So, but our model, we set a very clear target for it to predict, and that's whether a trial will meet one or more of its primary endpoints in the phase that it's in. But there are other targets that our model could look at in the future, and we've done some experimentation around this, and it could be, is the trial likely to complete on time, or is the trial likely to reach its target level of patients? These are important questions as well, that drug designers would like to know from the outset. Like how realistic is it that we could get 700 patients for this condition, with this number of sites in this number of countries, or how realistic is it that we can complete it in 12 months? So there are other goals or targets that we could predict, but at the moment, we're focused on whether a trial would meet its primary endpoint in the phase that it's in.
So primary endpoint reaching the primary endpoint doesn't necessarily correlate with a successful trial. Is that right?
Usually, if it meets its primary endpoint, it can progress to the next phase. But there's commercial decisions at play as well, right? It might be, whether it's smashed it out of the park, or whether it just met its endpoint, or whether competitors have come in while this trial has been running. There's lots of other factors as well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a drug's going to go all the way through to FDA approval. It just means that it's eligible to get to the next phase if it's met one of its primary endpoints.
Right. And does next phase mean phase 1 clinical trial, phase 2 clinical trial? Is that the phase you're talking about?
Yeah. So phase 1 is usually around, is something safe to use, and then phase 2, it's more around testing safety, but then you start to test efficacy as well, whether it works. And then phase 3 is testing whether it works on a much larger sample of patients. So once you progress through all those phases, and successfully, then that's when you can apply for, say, FDA approval. I've simplified that a bit, but that's generally the journey.
Yeah. And right now you're offering it for meeting the phase 1 endpoint. Is that the where the product stands right now?
No, we cover all phases, so we could help design any trial that's in phase 1, 2, or 3. So yeah, we cover all those phases. The predictions are pretty accurate across those three phases. Phase 2 tends to be the hardest for to get a successful trial, because that's where the rubber hits the road and you're trying to get efficacy for the first time, right? So if you're running a phase 2 trial, the probability of success is usually a bit lower than if you're trying to test safety, or in a phase 3 trying to prove efficacy on a larger sample.
In your test set, I mean, as you're developing this, this 90% accuracy, Saurabh, that you're talking about, is that across all three phases of clinical trials? Have you tried predicting FDA approval, or do you need more data, or you've tried and your accuracy isn't where you want it to be yet before you start offering that?
Yeah. So the accuracy between phases is pretty consistent, and also interestingly, for rare or novel conditions, the model predicts well in those areas as well. There was some concern that if something's never been tested before, a drug's never been tested for a particular condition, how can a model predict success rates? But it turns out that there's enough data on how trials are run in generally, what are good practices that are beneficial for rare and novel conditions as well. So I actually do see that that products like Trialkey might actually lead to more rare conditions being investigated and researched, because you can have greater confidence of outcomes. As a side note, in terms of FDA approval, that's probably one of the next models that we're going to tackle. We're trying to get as much data as we can around FDA approvals. It's a bit, the data sources aren't as transparent as, say, clinicaltrials.gov, where everything's registered. So we know what comes out the other end if something is approved by the FDA, but it's a little bit opaque about what actually got submitted to the FDA. So you can make some guesses about if something passed to phase 3. Yes, it probably did go through that process, but may have failed. So there's a few data challenges there, but something that we think we could get a model for in time.
How different does the model behave when looking at U.S. clinical trials or European clinical trials, or I don't know which protocol Australia follows, whether it's closer to Europe or the US? Is there a difference, or do you have to tweak the model for the regulatory environment that it's being tested in?
Great question. So so it turns out that there's a number of countries around the world that have their own database where clinical trials can get registered, but most significant ones will be registered on the global one, which is the American one. In terms of the way trials are run, there's enough consistency in the parameters between different countries that we can match up the data set. So, for example, in Australia, we have a database called the ANZCT, but it's almost identical to the one in the US. So we can map that data so that we can combine those data sets. And there's other ones around the world as well, and they're run reasonably consistently. What is interesting, though, is that some countries systematically overperform or underperform for various conditions or phases. And that's one of the insights from Trialkey. If you're running a particular trial for a drug and a condition, that there's countries and sites that are going to be beneficial to be in and ones that aren't going to be beneficial, and it varies between phase and condition. So it's incredible insights there where you can significantly improve your success rate just by knowing what jurisdictions to go to. And it might be something to do with patient populations, or it could be regulation. That's the part that the model doesn't tell us. We need subject matter experts to help inform us on that. But it's a fascinating insight. I know, Saurabh, you've got some had some examples of that as well.
Yeah, so one of the companies we're doing a bit of work with and talking to, they are doing a clinical trial around vitamin D supplements. So one of the things the model actually pulled out is if you're going to do that in Asia, you want to be in Indonesia. And probably a reasonable question to ask, because if you're in Australia, and it's an Australian company, We've got obviously people from Europe came here 200 years ago. Europe had didn't have a lot of sun in Australia. So people in Australia tend not to have vitamin D deficiency. Plus, we have a lifestyle which is very outdoorsy, very beachy, and all those kind of things. If you're in Indonesia, it's a heavily Islamic country, so people cover up a lot, and people are outside less. So they actually get a lot less sun exposure than they do here. I mean, the equivalence in America would be, look, if you're doing a vitamin D study, probably no point doing it in Florida on a beach, but you want to do it in Alaska. And all these things are hidden in the data, which when you say it, oh my god, that's so obvious. Um, Similar for different genetic conditions, like was what condition we're looking at? Model predicted you want people from Switzerland, because every region has slight genetic diversity of our heritage and evolution over time, and different conditions you actually want different population sets to help you kind of really to claw out efficacy or not.
That's fascinating. So this is a SaaS product, is that right? And it's customers go on to they subscribe, I presume, and then they go onto the platform and they load their data up themselves. Is that right? Can you talk about how it works practically?
So the way it works, you go on, you sign up for a trial, then if you're happy, you continue on. So the simple version is you have all those trials to search for. So you can type in a condition, look, cancer, small cell lung cancer. What are the trials currently in phase 3 that are going to complete in the next year? It gives you a list of all those trials and it gives you a lot of data about them. And it tells you why the prediction is 17% or 72%. And it gives you each of those 700 variables that were meaningful. They kind of bubble to the top. But then let's say that you have your own trial. We have an interface right now. It's almost like a clinical trial simulator. We can literally upload your protocol. We'll grab whatever variables we can. You might need to tweak some, adjust them, and then you can actually simulate that trial. And what we're building now, and hopefully be done the next couple of weeks, is almost like a bit of a slider bar where we'll recommend the optimal for every variable. But you might say, look, the model says we needed 700 patients, we can't afford it, and we can only get 300 patients based on our budget. So you can slide that down, and we'll tell you what the impact of that is on your probability of success. For the first couple, you probably need our help, but over time, companies will just be able to do this themselves.
Yeah. How many variables can you tweak?
Around 30 or 40 that you can tweak, and from those variables, that's when we can create the full 700 variables from those base 30 or 40 variables using natural language processing, using combinations of variables. But yeah, there'll be at least 30 to 40, and they vary from the simple stuff like choice of patients to the actual protocol itself, inclusion exclusion criteria, what endpoints you're trying to meet, things like who you want to work with, like principal investigators, what sites, what countries you want to be in. All that sort of stuff is selectable, and has an impact on the probability of success. So you can imagine, if you're tweaking 30 variables, there's the scope to really, I don't want to use the word gamify, but let's say optimize your trial. And often it's low hanging fruit that can be tackled. You could change, from doing open label masking to double blind, which is a technical thing, but just by changing that, it could significantly increase the probability for a certain phase or condition. And that's what our model will shed light on.
How big is the market for this, do you think?
So fingers crossed it's quite big, because what I'm hoping will happen with a tool like this is, I mean, right now about 35,000 trials happen in the world every year on humans. I think what a model like this will actually do is make it so there'll be millions of trials that will happen in AI, in the AI world, and you'll have less trials happening in people. So it might not be 35,000, it might be 5,000. But you'll find those trials will be like overfunded and over resourced, so they can kind of get through the game very, very quickly. Um, and at some point in time, it's going to be like, well, why would you do a trial in people if you haven't done it in AI first? It will almost become like an ethical thing. Like, I'm sure kids learning to drive in a decade, like you won't learn to drive in a car, you learn to drive in a simulator. And once you're great at that, then they'll let you out on the real road, because it would be so unsafe to let someone learn to drive on the real road. So I think this will just be a thing in 5 or 10 years. Every trial will happen in AI. And once they've optimized it and figured out which ones to back and not back, that's what they'll do in the human population.
Yeah, wow, that's exciting. That's fascinating. And you don't look at the molecules, though, do you?
Yeah, one of the benefits of using natural language processing models is that you can extract the molecules and compounds that were used for each trial, and then there's a separate database that has the properties of those molecules and compounds. And we're in the process of ingesting that information into the model. It's one of our next steps, and that will be very interesting to see what sort of an impact um, those properties will have on success rates. So my hypothesis is that they will have an impact, but not as much as the trial design itself. From what I've seen so far from Trialkey, is about 60% of the world's trials are designed poorly. There's major design flaws in them. So I think that there's a lot of drugs or devices that would probably have been successful had the trial have been structured correctly. It's not the underlying molecule or compound that wasn't the problem. Was the problem? It was the actual design of the trial that led it to failure. So I think hidden in the data there would be thousands of these drugs or devices that would have shown efficacy, and they're just sitting there orphaned at the moment. So maybe something like Trialkey might bring back some of those prospects and candidates, and better testing can be done.
Yeah, wow, that's exciting. Yeah. So the product is launching when?
So it launched about a month ago. So you can go on to Trialkey.ai, you can sign up now, you can get a bit of a trial. Um, One other point I'll make, just further to Damon's point. So where Damon and the guys really thought, oh, there's something to this, was during COVID. So that's when they just first built the model. There were about 800 vaccine candidates out in the world. And what the model predicted was Pfizer so Pfizer and Astro, Pfizer and Moderna. Sorry, Damon.
Pfizer and Moderna were, I think, 1 and 3 in our predictions.
And that's the way the world ended up, and that's the way reality happened. But if you knew that before the event, it's almost like buying a lottery ticket after it's drawn. Then you would have just over-indexed your effort and resources on those ones, and the other 750, you might have done the top 50, but the other 750 you just wouldn't have done. You would have really kind of pivoted your resources towards those guys. But that was an example of something really novel, right? That was all around mRNA vaccines, which hadn't really been done before, but the model still got it right. Because a big part of their success was how they designed their trials. And some of these large farmers just have more money, have more resources, have more expertise to design them better. And that's what I think will get democratized across, all pharmaceutical companies. They'll all have access to the same level of insight.
And particularly hospitals and universities, which are systematic underperformers when it comes to clinical trial success. The models shown that to be a fact of the data. So I think products like Trialkey could lift the standard of research in hospitals and universities and create a level playing field, I suppose, so that they could compete, with the bigger end of town.
And I would guess it would also increase investment for underfunded companies that have good ideas. If they can show that the likelihood of a trial succeeding, people would be more willing to invest. At some point, do you think this would be standardized so that there is a trial key seal of approval or trial key badge or something? Because predicting for the company is one thing, but the company being able to use that to raise capital or whatever use they might have beyond actually going ahead with a trial would be important.
Totally. I mean, I think what it will be, because the real subtlety in what you said was, I think a tool like ours would lead to an efficient allocation of capital, where money and resources will go to the trials and the drugs and the molecules that are most likely going to succeed. And once that kind of gets accepted and people see this working and see this working over time, I think you're right. It will flip the other way. So anyone who's looking to seek funding will probably have like a trial key rating. A bit like you get energy ratings for appliances, that same kind of thing. There'll be probably a similar rating for all trials. And then before they go to seek funding, they'll probably use a tool like ours to really optimize it, so to maximize the chance of success. And chance of success, it's a funny thing. Like in that rare kidney disease, 54% was amazing. But in something like obesity, you really want to be above 70% to be differentiating. Um, and then you can kind of use that, optimize, and it will just be a standard part of the funding process. Or for a lot of the large pharma, it'll probably be just a standard part of their internal due diligence as they choose which trials to cull and which ones to fund.
I'm wondering, Craig, whether you should join our marketing team. I like the Trialkey seal of approval. I'm really warming to that.
Yeah, well, that's that's amazing. Whose idea was this?
Well, the idea came about 3 years ago. It was the then CEO of Opyl, Michelle Gallagher, and I had a discussion around this market problem, and it was one that I couldn't believe hadn't been solved already, given it's $15 million on average to invest in a phase 2 trial for a pharmaceutical company. I'm running sports betting models in the background, and pharmaceutical companies and hospitals, universities aren't using big data for clinical trials. It just seemed like a complete, I guess, oversight that they weren't using machine learning and big data to help them design trials. So with that in mind, we set out to solve this problem, and we were one of the first. There's been one or two competitors and some academic papers written, but as I said before, this is still pretty much virgin territory. So yeah, coming from a sports betting background, I just could not believe that this hadn't been solved or attempted to be solved using machine learning.
Yeah, and I'm interested in the investment side. Are you thinking about making selling this data to investors?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we haven't quite figured out the right model, whether it's like a subscription fee you charge to investors or whether we actually just set up our own separate fund and use that to invest in. So that's why for now, I think it's just more Damon and I doing trades on the side. But once we kind of crack the pharmaceutical game, I think this will be the next use case. And we might then end up bifurcating the organizations. One's a lot more pharma focused, one's a lot more investor focused.
And as Damon, as you were saying, you were surprised no one's done this. This kind of a model could be applied to all kinds of things. Have you guys done any, or is it too early, or do you think you will?
No, I've looked at other areas, other applications for this type of modeling. One I've just launched actually is called golfswings.ai, which will I don't know if you're a golfer, Craig, or know any golfers, but it can take your golf swing just filmed from a regular smart device. It can determine all your movement points and then use explainable AI to predict what movements you can work on to fast track your improvement, which ones are most likely to result in a handicap reduction. So we've only just launched that product, golfswings.ai, and there's other applications as well for digital marketing, all sorts of possibilities in this space. But the one this Trialkey one that we're talking about today, given the size of the industry and what's at stake, this is an absolute prime candidate for this technology, and we're excited about it. But yeah, you're right. There are definitely lots of use cases.
And Saurabh, what you were saying about, I think, did you say 30,000 odd clinical trials a year? And that could be reduced to 5,000 if people knew the likelihood of success in a trial, and then you'd run them in simulation before going into human trials. That's a pretty powerful idea.
So, and just a bit further to Damon's point, I mean, basically what the guys have done is they've built a generic way to solve what's actually a super generic problem. You got 1,000 variables, you know an outcome. What variables lead to that outcome, and how do you weight those possibilities? And it just happens to be applied to the clinical trial space, and that will be what we'll do for the next couple of years till we really run this problem down. But it's a generic solution to an actual super generic problem.
Is there anything I haven't asked that you guys want to say?
No, I think that was a really good discussion. Oh, you asked all the right questions.
Hi, I wanted to jump in and give a shout out to our sponsor, NetSuite by Oracle. A little quick math. The less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more margin you have and the more money you keep. But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more. So, to reduce costs and headaches, smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one platform and one source of truth. With NetSuite, you reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessed from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems. You improve efficiency by bringing all of your business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move. So do the math. See how you'll profit with NetSuite. Popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/IonAI. That's IonAI, EYEONAI, all run together. Again, head to netsuite.com/IonAI. That's it for this episode. I want to thank Saurabh and Damon for their time. If you want to read a transcript of the conversation today, you can find one on our website, IonAI. That's EYE-ON.AI. Take a look at Opyl at OPYL.ai. And remember, the singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world. So pay attention.